Thank you for joining us today. We have a very exciting webinar today. We will be honoring our first Salute to Excellence winner, Pilot of the Year, Lieutenant Commander Robert McCabe. We normally make these presentations during Heli Expo, and unfortunately that wasn't able to happen this year. We'll also be discussing IIMC and spatial disorientation, so it's a great presentation. Let me introduce today's speakers. First of all, Jim Viola, President and CEO of HAI. He'll be joined by Lieutenant Commander Rob McCabe, who is a Coast Guard pilot and HAI Salute to Excellence 2021 Pilot of the Year. He'll be followed by Tony Carvalhos, who is the Chief of Safety Assurance and Risk Reduction, Office of Safety and Environmental Health at the U.S. Coast Guard Headquarters. We have Commander Ben Walton, who is Command Safety Officer at the U.S. Coast Guard Aviation Training Center. And we have Chris Hill, who is the Director of Safety here at HAI, among many other hats that he wears. This is an interactive presentation. We do encourage your questions. Please, if you have a question, don't use the chat feature. Please use the question feature. That box is in the bottom of your screen or on the side of your screen, depending on the application you're using to watch today. Fill out the question, and we will try to answer as many questions as we possibly can during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Lieutenant Commander McCabe has graciously agreed to join us and will be available to answer questions about his participation in the rescue and the subsequent training on the spatial disorientation. As always, this webinar is being recorded. We will be trying to provide the video link as quickly as possible after the fact. It will be posted to our website, and we will have it available to, probably tomorrow through YouTube and on our website. Finally, there will be a web link that we'll be sharing during the course of the presentation. It'll appear on your screen where you should be able to copy it. We're going to try and send it through chat, which should be hopefully an active link. But either way, we'll give you a second or so to try to write it down. It will be a shortened one, so it won't be too long. And with that, let me stop sharing and let me introduce Jim Viola, President and CEO of HAI.
All right, thanks, Dan. It's great to be here today, and we're honoring our first of our annual Salute to Excellence Award winners, and we're doing it via webinar, just as you said, Dan. You know, the intent being that we give these awards out every year at Heli Expo, and of course we are all looking forward to getting to New Orleans this year. But sometimes, you know, life just has a way of changing the plan. So not only our plan, but also there could be other options. Our Salute to Excellence Pilot of the Year, Lieutenant Commander Robert McCabe, is a great example. I mean, he'll tell you he didn't start out to be a helicopter pilot. He joined the Coast Guard with a desire to actively be involved in humanitarian and search and rescue type work. And while he was assigned to the ship in Austria, Oregon, he was inspired watching the MH-60 Jayhawk perform multiple harrowing rescues. So he changed his focus and attended flight school after his first Coast Guard tour. So we at HAI are grateful that Lieutenant Commander McCabe changed his focus and he became a pilot, because he is one of those pilots who works for a change when he sees the necessity. And as you may guess from today's topic, he experienced spatial disorientation during one of those rescue flights. He identified and he announced the problem and then initiated the corrective action. That wasn't it though. After landing, then he got involved and began working with the Coast Guard to enhance training to help all other Coast Guard pilots to learn and identify the signs of spatial disorientation. To me, it doesn't get much better than recognizing a hazard and then working with others to avoid that same situation. So UIMC, unintended IMC, or IIMC, whatever you want to call it, you know, helicopter pilots seem to just experience these situations much too often. I think we try to stay visual when we should land, or because we have been trained and equipped properly with the aircraft, commit to the procedures that you have been trained to and execute that procedure. HAI has just helped launch the 56 Seconds to Live educational campaign, and you can find more on HAI's website or on the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team website. So we have a full webinar today, so let's get started. I'd like to have Lieutenant Commander McCabe turn his camera on and join us.
Hello, sir. Thanks for having me.
No, absolutely. So to start out today, we're just can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? I gave you a little bit of an overview there, but tell us a little bit more.
Okay, so you've pretty much covered it. I started on a couple ships in the Coast Guard after graduating the academy in 2007. Saw the light, the helicopters looked exciting. And that's been about 10 years of flying helicopters. I love it. It's been very good to me, and I've been fortunate to have learned from a lot of great mentors and served in some great places. I started in Oregon, characterized by rocky coastline and low visibility, high mountains, pretty diverse SAR area, and then moved on to Sitka, Alaska, where it was more of the same. And I can't say enough about the people I learned from on the way here, the people I work with today, both other pilots and maintainers. And I've been here in Cape Cod for about 2 years. And I thought, honestly, up in Alaska, I'd seen probably the most challenging conditions I would have seen. But I've been humbled here in Cape Cod by the diversity of weather. So it really shows that I think anywhere you're flying, you can be caught off guard. And yeah. This has been a great tour so far. I've got about 2 more years here on the Cape.
Great. So in a minute, we're gonna have that video that Dan was talking about the award. But can you walk us through the events that transpired during that rescue? You know, was this from your current duty station?
It is. It was here in Cape Cod. I was on a 24-hour duty, typical of what we do, and it was the weekend. Incidentally, I was about 4 minutes from getting off duty, getting ready to head home, and the alarm went off. We had a call of an EPIRB, not unlike the ELTs that we fly with, 406 megahertz signal. And a lot, you know, I got to say, in my experience, sometimes that could be an EPIRB that fell off a bulkhead and it's just going off on the ship. And the captain says, thanks, we're fine. Or maybe it's in a trash heap up in Alaska. But so we went out there not knowing what we were going to get into. Took about 20 minutes to get there. We DF'd on it, direction finding equipment. And of course, there was a debris field, nothing left of a boat and a raft. And from there, we went to work with what we do. The crew did a phenomenal job. And I got to say, I was sitting left seat. I was not the flying pilot during that rescue. The rest of the crew did a phenomenal job pulling the one survivor from the raft and to safety. He was hypothermic. And he quickly told us that we had 3 other people in the water. He wasn't sure where they were. And that's when the sun was setting. And unfortunately, we were goggling up in a squall and looking for those 3 people. The swimmer did a great job determining that, hey, this he's really cold, he's hypothermic, but the right decision is to keep looking for these other people. If we leave now, they're not gonna have a chance. So we turned the heat on full blast and started searching. And that's when we got into our little inadvertent IIMC spatial disorientation.
Wow, I mean, it sounds like you really had a lot of things going on with the sun setting, the goggles coming on, the squall. So, you know, what if there was like one thing that you wanted to give a piece of advice to others when everything's, you know, going crazy like that, what would you say?
You know, train hard, because I think we get about 10% of our brain power in the aircraft of what we have on the ground. It really is incumbent on us to practice things going wrong. We have a lot of automation in the MH60. We have rad out holds, we have bar out hold, things that'll keep us in the air. We have a hover coupler that can hold a hover for us in bad weather. We have flight director cues that can give us instrumentation up to safe flight. So I had all that at my disposal. Like I said, I'd been working in pretty difficult circumstances. I was training, hovering on instruments all the time. And despite those things, I still found it incredibly difficult to fight my vestibular cues, the things that were telling me that, hey, we're going backwards right now. And the other pilot, unfortunately, was feeling almost the opposite thing, that we were crashing forward. So really, despite all the cool bells and whistles we had on our helicopter, I think the most important lesson to me is, number one, learn the language of disorientation. Be prepared to announce it early, and fall back on those basic instrument skills. That's what really saved our bacon that night. We tried a couple other things, and luckily, just remaining calm, we were able to get that helicopter into forward flight together. It really took 2 people. I'm privileged I get to work with a multi-crew platform and an extremely capable platform. So that would be my lesson, honor those basic instrument skills.
Yeah, well, and also what you said there was train hard. That should be, when you go out and execute some of those hard missions, I guess it's a more of a relief if you know you've trained as hard as you can and you don't have to go all the way out there. So with that, we'll go ahead and get the video going. We can get Dan to get that started, and we'll go ahead and turn our cameras off for a second.
Helicopter Association International proudly presents the Salute to Excellence Pilot of the Year Award, sponsored by Rotary magazine. This award salutes either extraordinary professionalism or an outstanding single feat by a helicopter pilot or pilots. U.S. Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander Robert McCabe joined the Coast Guard to participate in humanitarian and search and rescue missions. It was while he served aboard a Coast Guard vessel that he witnessed the heroic actions of Coast Guard helicopters. He knew then he wanted to be a pilot. Robert completed flight training in 2012 and served as an MH-60T Jayhawk pilot in Astoria, Oregon, and Sitka, Alaska, before his current assignment at U.S. Coast Guard Air Station Cape Cod in Massachusetts. In Cape Cod, he stands ready for missions across New England from New York to Maine. In addition to pilot in command, he is also an instructor pilot and flight examiner, instructing and mentoring junior pilots and crew members. On the evening of November 24, 2019, his skills and experience were put into practice. The air station received an emergency beacon alert from the fishing vessel Leonardo. It had suddenly and unexpectedly capsized 24 miles southwest of Martha's Vineyard, throwing all 4 crew members into the 50-degree water. Once on scene among 10-foot seas and 30-knot winds, Robert's crew found a lone survivor in a life raft adrift in the debris field. The severely hypothermic survivor was hoisted aboard and successfully stabilized. During the rescue, the sun set and a squall with sleet moved in, reducing visibility to a quarter mile and raising the seas to 15 feet. Rather than follow a typical search altitude of 300 feet, Robert directed the other pilot to fly a low, 80-foot air taxi to continue searching the debris field for remaining survivors. With their focus mostly outside the aircraft, searching the rough water with a searchlight in flying sleet, both pilots became disoriented. Robert noticed his disorientation during a radio call. He had the sensation the aircraft was about to crash. The instruments indicated it had started to bank 40 degrees, simultaneously pitching more than 14 degrees nose up and rapidly slowing while descending. Despite the sensation, it was 10 seconds before Robert recognized disorientation and announced it. He then coached the flying pilot through a successful instrument transition to stable flight. Robert's situational awareness, decisiveness, and assertiveness were instrumental in leading the crew to avoid a near-catastrophic situation. Robert's experience and willingness to quickly report it led to training protocols that may well save more lives. Please join the HAI Board of Directors in saluting Robert McCabe, recipient of the 2021 Salute to Excellence Pilot of the Year Award.
All right, if you would come back on. All right, well, thank you. Certainly on behalf of the HAI Board of Directors and the Rotorcraft community, we congratulate you on this award. We also want to express our gratitude to you for taking what could have been a tragic experience and turning it into a substantial learning opportunity for not only yourself, the Coast Guard, but for everyone in our industry. And at this point, the part of the webinar is I understand you would like to address how this opportunity became a more significant training program. So over to you. Thank you very much. Congratulations, we appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm very appreciative and honored to be receiving this. I consider it receiving on behalf of the Coast Guard, honestly. I train with and work with a phenomenal group. Thank you for, it speaks volumes that HAI is addressing just culture, safety culture, reporting culture, especially when it comes to inadvertent IMC. I think the more we promote a culture of sharing and learning from each other, that truly saves lives. So thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me. I'll briefly summarize some of the lessons I took from this case and how I hope me and my unit and the broader Coast Guard safety programs have improved some of our practices. First, I alluded to it earlier, but between the wind, the sleet, the waves, everything was giving me very different cues. And I think talking training hard, we train hard here. And I had about 2,000 hours before I really experienced a significant emotional spatial disorientation event. People talk about getting the leans. I'm pretty good instrument pilot, if I don't mind saying so. And it still caught me very off guard. And it was hard to combat. So how do we move forward? How do I move forward and bring the unit with me and hopefully the broader community? The first lesson I mentioned earlier is learning to speak the language of disorientation, being familiar with recognized, unrecognized, and incapacitating disorientation is important. We in the Coast Guard speak a lot about inadvertent IMC, and we also speak about unusual attitudes, at least in the 60 community. That's what I can speak to for the most part. However, we also intentionally put ourselves in very low-vis situations, very demanding situations, intentionally flying just about IMC with a visual purpose. We can't do our mission up at instrument altitudes. We need to get down low to see the problem and execute rescues. So for that, it really takes some commitment, both in training and posturing. How are you going to set up your aircraft? This community I saw that I'm addressing now is very broad, probably a lot of experience, different helicopters, but everyone has some level of automation and basic instrument skills. So learning the most of what my helicopter can give me, whether that's altitude hold, flight director cues back up to altitude, at the press of a button, if I need to get out of there, or some other level of automation. I think being intimately familiar with that stuff is important. What I've changed here at Cape Cod is we often train these instrument approaches to a hover. We have certain minimums where we need to go from using a view limiting device and getting ourselves down to a hover for practice or in real life. We practice that frequently. We have certain minimums, and in doing those, I've gotten in the habit of at the bottom simulating that we didn't break out. And now you got a boat that's on fire half a mile away. Now what? And it puts us in a difficult position of making those really hard decisions. How hard are you going to push? You got to recognize that yourself and your crew are in danger as you commit to an instrument hover. So what tools do you have? How are you going to solve this problem? And that's what I've been pushing here with the help of the safety department. So that's part of the local curriculum, speaking the language of spatial disorientation and also setting up the helicopter. Another thing that the Coast Guard at large has been pushing for a while now is sterile cockpit and limiting communication during critical phases of flight. I've given that a lot of thought before. I've learned a lot on the way here to where I am now on that, but it still caught me off guard. And the one thing I'd like to impress on everyone, and I'm trying to push here, is right before this happened, I was making a radio transmission. I was calculating fuel I had on scene, how much longer I could fly, search, and still recover with our survivor. I was doing that communication during a turn, a decelerating turn. And even though I wasn't flying, those two things combined are really what got me there. A decelerating turn, I think, is one of the surefire ways to experience spatial D. And that's where I found myself. So back to the point, limiting communications, limiting those non-essential communications until you roll wings level. Let's get in a stable flight regime before we do those non-essential tasks. I've really gotten a new respect for pilot monitoring duties, when it's safe to talk, when it's when your only job should be monitoring the instruments. So working with safety department, we're trying to push that message. And lastly, the highest respect for the insidious nature of spatial disorientation. Like I said, I felt pretty confident going into this case. A little over 2,000 hours in just this aircraft, plenty of SAR and lots of low vis SAR. And it still caught me off guard. So I think for the entire helicopter community at large, my lessons are knowing when you have to commit to that instrument flight, respecting that and not wavering on that. That's really important. Doesn't mean you can't find safe ways to fly instruments, but you have to know when to commit to the instruments. 2 pilots outside on goggles with 2 searchlights pointing down in those conditions, that was pushing it. And I think we got lucky that we were able to recognize the disorientation. So hopefully some lessons turn luck on my part into better game plans for future crews. So with that, I owe a lot of the getting traction on this in the Coast Guard. Here at this unit, I can push certain things with my fellow pilots, but engaging safety department, reporting it is really what gets it some traction and moving it along in the Coast Guard. We have a great safety program, this unit, and across the board in the Coast Guard for reporting culture, just culture, people doing the right things, coming back and telling where they screwed up and not getting punished for it. So with that, I'd like to take a moment and introduce the Rotary Wing Safety Officer from last year, Lieutenant Justin Moore. He did a lot of the legwork on researching the language of spatial disorientation for me. In this community, we didn't talk about it a lot, and he really helped move the football down the field in that regard. So for a moment, I'd just like to thank Justin he's joined me here. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lieutenant Commander, and I appreciate the audience and the opportunity. As a flight safety officer, this is exactly what we look for. It's the perfect case study because it comes at no cost to the organization, and it gives us an opportunity to look across our own organization and the industry as a whole to find really how well we're doing and what solutions we can start to implement. And I think one of the important things that spatial disorientation does is it provides a misconception that those that fall victim to spatial disorientation are in some way inadequate, untrained, unprofessional. And that's simply not the case. It's a fact of life in aviation, and it's whether you're a professional crew or you're a private pilot, we are all susceptible to human factors, and spatial disorientation is often the result of a combination of influences and decisions that we can't necessarily get away from, particularly in an organization like the Coast Guard, where we're going out intentionally into those circumstances. So some of the key takeaways, the most important thing, and Lieutenant Commander McCabe has mentioned it multiple times, is the reporting culture. This is an event that could have been discussed as a crew and moved on, but instead they took it upon themselves and very forthcoming and voluntarily came in and shared their experiences. We used animation. We looked across the entire organization. It's a collaborative effort with Headquarters Safety, who you'll hear from the remainder of some of this webinar. Also Aviation Training Center Mobile, who's our standardization folks, and 7-Eleven, who's Aviation Doctrine, all had a hand in moving this football down the field, as we've talked about. But some of the key safety takeaways that I like to bring up is this really unpacks risk perception and hazardous attitudes. We don't talk about hazardous attitudes that often, but one of the things I think every professional pilot at some point is susceptible to is the complacency of the invulnerability. We all know spatial disorientation happens. We all know that the outcome can be very severe. Several high-profile cases in recent history show that, but we never necessarily believe it's going to happen to us. And then human performance variability. You heard the Lieutenant Commander talk about how frequently he had been in similar situations, and the wrong combination of external cues and workload allowed him and his pilot to both be vulnerable today. So talking about it on a regular basis and genuinely integrating threat and error management greatly reduces the likelihood of a negative outcome, even if you find yourself in that circumstance. So That'll bring us to the safety recommendations, and I definitely want to leave that for my headquarters folks to share where we've gone from there. But an incredible opportunity for us to learn and be reminded that a lot of the points that were made in the video you watched sound familiar because they've led to tragedy. And this was a pretty benign event because of the professionalism of the crew. But a true safety culture doesn't rest on the successes of the past to guarantee safety in the future. We're constantly trying to learn. And I think this crew has done an excellent job helping us get into a much better position than we were before they took that flight. So thank you. And thank you, Lieutenant Commander.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to give him a chance. He really did a lot to research recent case study in just in the Coast Guard cases of inadvertent IMC, spatial disorientation, and the consequences. So with that, thank you. I'd like to pass the mic over to Dr. Tony Carvalhos. He's the Chief of Safety Assurance and Risk Reduction at Coast Guard Headquarters, the Office of Safety and Environmental Health. And he could speak to some of the more vestibular and the direction the Coast Guard is going. Thanks, Tony.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Rob. Really appreciate it. A great presentation, very insightful. And before I go any further, certainly I want to echo Mr. Viola's hearty congratulations of this prestigious and well-deserved award. And on behalf of the Office of Safety and Environmental Health, and specifically your colleagues in the aviation safety group down here, we absolutely want to extend our congratulations to you first and foremost, but also to the air station overall. You guys have demonstrated, as Justin just articulated, these events will occur. We need to educate, we need to inform, and we need to demonstrate that even our most proficient and our rock star pilots are susceptible to this, and look towards what can we do better to improve the safety of our operational community. So job well done, great job. I also want to continue with the thread that you started associated with the deficiencies that are inherent in human physiology. And that is the topic of my presentation today. I was asked to share a little bit about what is the reality, the physiological reality. What can we do to compensate, to adapt to these limitations? And then what are some of the experiences we've had with Coast Guard aviation in the presence or exposure to these events, and what have we done in that regard? Before I go any further, certainly, the human infatuation with flying has a long and very storied history. From the time the Icarus experimented with those wax wings, to modern day advances in science and technology, there's one immutable that we must maintain awareness on, and that is the human physiology is severely outdated. And if we were a computer, we'd be in the junkyard. We are in need of significant system upgrades. But unfortunately, unless we're prepared, and hopefully maybe in the future, there'll be advances in science and technology whereby maybe we'll be able to swap out or augment some of our sensory packages. The reality is that if we rely on evolution, we have a long way to go before we see any meaningful improvement. So the reality is that aviation operations, we're forcing human physiology with its outdated sensory package to really perform in an environment that we're really not wired for, that we can actually perform well. And that is the reality of the human system, if you will, right? We were developed, evolution knew that we were going to be essentially feet on ground. It was going to, we were going to have very limited speed and acceleration experiences. So therefore, our sensory packages really are designed for that type of environment. Fortunately for us, though, the human is a pretty adaptive system. So we know of things called complex adaptive systems. Those represent the vast majority of systems in society today, and the human is one of those. And what does that mean? That means that we as a system can integrate information, that we can, as long as we're monitoring correctly, as long as we're surveilling our environmental and situational characteristics and cues, that we can adapt and take that information and have the right course of action to respond to that particular set of circumstances. Ever changing, it's dynamic and it's adaptive. And that's one of the things that keeps the human in a viable and a sustainable state, and why we are able to accommodate the stressors, namely in the aviation environment, that are maybe outside our sensory limitations, but because of this adaptive characteristic, we consolidate information. We, through our training and our education, are able to adapt what that means. What that means and respond appropriately. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit about the physiological reality and what those limitations really impart on our ability to execute and deliver an activity or a mission that we're being asked to deliver. So I know that a lot of this information is known to everyone, so I'm just going to go through it relatively quickly. There are three primary sensory packages that the human is outfitted with, and these are referred to as the visual sensory, the vestibular inner ear sensory system, and the proprioceptive system. So in the visual, our dominant, that's the preferred sensory package. It's the best mechanism that we have to understand and to respond to the situation at hand. Unfortunately, though, while the visual system is acquiring all the stimuli out in the environment, it's going through the brain. And the brain really is the limitation in accurate perception, acknowledging or understanding illusions, and then responding to them appropriately. And that's where the limitations occur. There are hundreds of different types of illusions that we are susceptible to. Things that are associated with motion and timing sequencing, spatial alignment, orientations, angles, luminance, contrasting, color differences. All those things are when manipulated correctly, create illusions in the perception of the individual that may not be accurate to the situation being experienced. Some of you may know about experiments associated, just to illustrate this illustration or this illusion. One of the many illusions is the one that's always perplexing to me. Certainly, this experiment had individuals playing basketball, passing around a basketball. The experimenter just simply asked the individual, the experimental subjects watching this interaction, to just count the number of times the basketball is transferred between these players. And at the end, the experimenter asked, so how many times did the team with this uniform get the ball? And then the experimenter asked, how many of you saw the gorilla in the scenario? And very few individuals noted that during the sequencing of passing the ball around, a gorilla actually walked into the frame, participated in the exchange, walked away, did some jumping jacks, walked away, and the vast majority of individuals simply didn't catch that anomaly in the situation. That illustrates a concept called perceptual blindness, that while the stimuli was there and it acknowledged, it was received by the visual sensor, but it was interpreted by the brain as benign. That gorilla is not supposed to be there because the brain is taking those electrical stimuli from the eye and interpreting reality. And under a normal basketball exchange scenario, there's no gorilla in there. There's just people passing balls around. So this concept of perceptual blindness indicates or reveals that the brain steps in to make sense of all the stimuli, and it needs to. Could you imagine if the brain wasn't stepping in to make sense, the chaos, the utter disruption to try to interpret and make sense of all those electrical signals that are coming into the brain to represent the visual field. So the brain is doing a very necessary function to maintain some level of sanity for the human, but in the process, it may very well ignore or discount content that really shouldn't be in this visual representation, but it might be extremely valuable and necessary for one to understand the potential crisis and the significance of an event. So while the visual field is the most dominant, we're absolutely extremely dependent on it because it then will assist the other sensory systems to identify deviations from normalcy. It does itself have susceptible characteristics to be prone to these illusions that misrepresent reality. So that's a fact. So as we go down this list, the vestibular is another very necessary sensory package that really allows us to understand orientation and gravitational pull on the human. But devoid of that visual representation, that system is extremely susceptible and prone to misrepresentation of true states. And as Rob was talking about the actual evolution of a low and slow, gradual banking and turning, those are the types of deviations or orientations that this system can't manage very well. And it would require then the visual field to provide the additional insight, the additional information to say, oh, in fact, yeah, I did bank right, but now I want to go to level, but the vestibular system without the visual doesn't recognize that as it going back to level. It actually interprets that as, oh, you're banking right. And it's going to aggravate that left-hand bank. So while the vestibular system does in fact provide some valuable information and content, without that visual sensor to augment, to provide us some additional information, it is extremely susceptible to misrepresentation and misinterpretation by the individual. So that's the second sensory package that has a lot of limitations, that is extremely dependent on a visual. And the third one really introduces it even a more susceptible. And this one is called a proprioceptive, and it's associated with the tissue and the joints and the nerves in our body that do provide some directional and positional information to us. However, once again, when you take away that visual, the opportunity to misrepresent falls into the same dependency as the vestibular system. It does require that visual to understand, well, my arm is here, but in a slow and progressive deviation in activity, that particular orientation, that awareness can become disrupted unless my eyes are giving me the necessary information. So I just want to acknowledge, probably making a very obvious reality, just aware to everyone, that these sensory systems are, while important for our daily lives, for our orientation, when we are performing in a terrestrial environment, once we go into environments that stress those sensory thresholds, operational thresholds, they are very ripe for error and very ripe for misrepresentation. So that's, I don't want to go into a lot more detail in the physiology side, because I want to really focus on what to do about it. What are the countermeasures? What do we know about this? So the first place we look really is to mishaps. So what do our mishaps tell us? And this is a slide that looked at DOD aviation mishaps, and specifically, what were the findings? What were those influences, those factors that these mishap analyses revealed associated with the event? And you see the extreme dominance of what was present. What were the influence that were identified by the accident investigation boards as either influencing or causing the mishap? And to Rob's point and Justin's point, you really need to understand the information that everyone brings to the scene and how that information is being shared to make sense of the environment and to make sense of those cues. And while the more autonomous technology aspects are not identified in mishaps, that just reveals that while technology is available, it doesn't prevent the mishap. The technology is an aid that if the brain and the training isn't taken into consideration what the significance of that technology or what that sensor is telling me, then the sensor by itself, the technology by itself, unless the technology takes control of the asset itself, it's not going to be very effective towards SD related mishaps. It really is an augmenter, an information source that if used correctly, the pilots can prevent then the undesirable event. So regardless of how much technology we put in, how many sensor packages we put in, we're still going to be dependent on the human to integrate, to consider, and to ultimately then make the right decision. And that's where the complex adaptive system notion really comes in, right? As a complex adaptive system, you're continuously taking information from those relevant elements in your operational environment and asking, what does this mean? What are the viable, what are the requisite behaviors, responses from me? And if I provide this response, what is the potential consequence? And that's the advantage that humans have that quite often technology and sensory systems don't have. But we're making a huge assumption in that this is a disorientation event that's recognized, right? That in a type 2, type 3 like spatial disorientation, where it's unrecognized or incapacitating, this issue is off the table. But in a vast majority of mishaps, they are predominantly in a recognized, and people just either delay or make the wrong control inputs to actually aggravate the situation as opposed to resolve. So when we look for countermeasures, certainly one of the ripe areas is to focus on what were the findings? How can we improve crew resource management? How can we improve our training in our education to ensure better scanning? How can we support the pilot in this very critical, complex operational scenario where they're taking a tremendous amount of data and making the correct decision? So let's move on to the countermeasures. Right, here's some potential countermeasures. And it's all about anticipation, right? It's all about, and again, I suspect that I know for a fact that I'm preaching to the choir. Rob and Justin just articulated this so well. It's all about awareness. It's all about informing. It's all about preparing for an absolute. It's not if, it's when. Absolutely. Human physiology will dictate that in everyone's aviation career, that you're going to, if you're in there long enough, and it doesn't, based on our data, it doesn't take that much time, you are going to be confronted with an SD challenge. How do you prepare? So it's all about training, it's all about educating, it's all about improving those skill sets in our operational communities. And it's all about sharing. It's all about, Justin made that comment about, had I not been putting my head down and doing this calculation in a decelerating maneuver, man, that's what hit me. All right, well, you know what? That's guidance, right? That is very valuable input that we need to get to the operational community as another highlight, as another evidence of the susceptibility, and in some instances how frail, how prone the sensory package is to misrepresentation and is to these illusions and devoid of information. And certainly we can't make light of maintaining good health and physical fitness a sensory package is part of the overall human physiology. That physiology requires, someone that's well hydrated, someone that has adequate sleep. Any compromise whatsoever is not ill, isn't on any sort of, medication. All those things, in fact, compromise the sensory package to work effectively, but more importantly, are then the central information. The brain is compromised, and as the brain receives these data sources, it then can't integrate and consider them well enough to make the right decision. So maintaining good health, good physical fitness, getting adequate rest, and understanding that when you're performing these activities at unnatural or less than optimal human physiological time, and that is between about 2300 and 05, 06 in the morning, our physiology isn't designed to be up and working. We have biochemicals being prevented or suppressed from the human physiology that are telling the brain to go to sleep, go into a restorative period. So that's unnatural. You're more susceptible as the events in a sleep deprived or in a scenario where you're operating during what we call the red zone between 2300 and about 05, 06. So that information I know is available and distributed, and I know our pilots are very sensitive and take that into consideration, certainly. So what else is there? I think that Justin talked about this, and I think that was very eloquent. Don't think that you're not a real aviator if you think that being susceptible to an SD event makes you less of one. That's absolutely the wrong message. Absolutely not. It's the physiology, folks, and there's no way around that physiological reality. We can trick it, we can manipulate it, we can try to work around it. We'll do whatever workaround you want to try. The fact of the matter is that basic deficit state is present, and it will rise, and quite often at the absolute least opportune time. So you need to be prepared. You need to understand those conditions. You need to continuously monitor and surveil for those conditions, and then react appropriately. And that open line of communications, crew resource management, absolutely critical. But with a caveat, right? I think Rob mentioned it earlier. The sterile cockpit has a very important role. So you need to know when to speak up. But if you feel in any way compromised or have some doubts, it is speak up, even though you might be in a sterile cockpit scenario. It is speak up, because others may either be in the same situation or will be your lifeline. They're the ones that will step in, and as a team, you guys will definitely get out of it. So again, more emphasis on education and training, and that last one is about briefing and rehearsing. You got to train. You have to ask, what if this happens? What would you do? And you need to play those scenarios all the time. I know it might be monotonous. I know that I already know all that. The way you get out of these situations is by having those behavioral patterns hardwired into your brain, so that you're not going to have to be in a time critical scenario trying to figure out what exactly is the appropriate. You want those hardwired, and the only way it's going to be hardwired is if you continuously replay and continue to replay those scenarios, those responses. When do I take controls? When do I assume controls because I'm not getting the right response from my co-pilot? Those things need to be well rehearsed and well played out, and there's absolutely no substitute for that. And I just want to make before I jump into the exposure for the Coast Guard, I just want to make one other point regarding, and maybe this will resonate, and that is, if we were using the concept of identifying the state of our material system, fully mission capable, partially mission capable, not mission capable, I would say that in the vast majority of scenarios, especially low light, night scenarios, cloud, fog, all those visually deprived mission execution, that we should also be sort of classifying the human system. And I would contend that in those scenarios, the human system is in a partially mission capable state, that those sensory packages are not foolproof. Those sensory packages will fail. They will not be telling you the truth throughout this evolution. So therefore, consider that when you go into those scenarios, that you as a system, like you just labeled your material system, you as the human element in this system are in a less than full mission capable status. And I think if we start thinking about that concept, maybe we'll be more receptive to, okay, so what do I do? What are things that I need to establish up front during my mission planning and my crew briefs? What are we all going to do before we get airborne for this high risk evolution? Okay, I just have one slide because I think Ben Walton's going to get into a lot more of the details, but certainly I asked one of my team members, Mark Bruno, to do a quick mishap data query of Coast Guard mishaps from November 2009 to December 2020. And in that time frame, the Coast Guard experienced 43 events. 74 events, and 73 of which were in the rotor wing community. Not surprising by virtue of the types of accelerations, decelerations, angular displacements. The rotor wing is a far more susceptible platform to SD events, and certainly our mishap data clearly revealed that susceptibility. When we look at how often these events occur, we get one approximately every 20,000 flight hours. In our organization, that's approximately one every 2 months. So we fly about 20,000 hours every 2 months. Pretty frequent. From my perspective, I think that's something to be certainly concerned about, right? Do we want to have our folks in this situation every 2 months to have that potential for a catastrophic event, which certainly raises then the need and the sensitivity for very proactive and very well-resourced initiatives to make sure that we protect our crews and our assets. And we look at these events, 56, about 3 times more likely to happen during the night than during the day. When we look at VMC, IMC, it's almost like an even split, but certainly a little bit more towards VMC. Fortunately for us, the vast majority of these events resulted in no damage. Thankfully, no damage, no injury. And a lot of that is because of the professionalism, the dedication of folks like Rob that understand the susceptibility, take it upon themselves to learn and to prepare for these eventualities. Because again, it's not a question of if, it's simply a question of when. So that concludes my portion of the webinar. I want to now introduce Commander Ben Walton, who is going to talk to us about the Coast Guard SD program. Ben Walton is with our Aviation Training Center down in Mobile, Alabama. And hand it over to you, Ben.
All right, thanks, Dr. Carvalhos. Again, my role in this as part of the schoolhouse down here in Mobile for the Coast Guard Aviation Training Center is to speak to where our training program was and where it is today, and where we hope to continue to take it with regard to spatial disorientation, unusual attitudes, and inadvertent IMC. Essentially, the catalytic moment or moments that we had in Coast Guard aviation were really centered around 2 major mishaps that we had in our aviation community. One in 2010 in Detroit, where a Coast Guard helicopter encountered spatial disorientation after they departed a hover behind a well-lit boat. They had gotten behind a boat to do some hoist work, and the boat was very well lit, and they had to go goggles up as a result. And to that end, the their night visual adaptation had been diminished. When they transitioned forward away from that boat, they got into a spatial disorientation and the aircraft entered the water. Fortunately, in that case, all 3 crew members were able to egress the helicopter and be picked up. Conversely, in 2012, here in Mobile, we had a Coast Guard helicopter enter inadvertent IMC conditions in the Mobile Bay area. That crew encountered also got into spatial D as a result of inadvertent IMC, and tragically, that helicopter entered the water and it cost us all 4 crew members' lives. Those 2 events put together in such quick succession for us spurred us into action that what we had for training and what we were training our crews to do and see was insufficient. And so we looked ourselves in the mirror and said, hey, where is our formal training? Where is our formal guidance? Because what we learned from that 2012 mishap, senior leadership made sure to insert or at least acknowledge that what those pilots did were instinctive flight control inputs. And that's, again, where we talk about what Justin and Rob and Dr. Carvalhos mentioned is that the physiological limitations are going to be false indications for you. And to follow your instincts is not what we want pilots to do. We know that from the general aviation community as well as the military aviation community, that when a pilot goes inadvertent IMC following VMC conditions, there is a strong, almost unquenchable desire to get back down to visual conditions. And as a result, that sometimes has tragic consequences. So what we need, as Dr. Carvalhos pointed out, was you need to be hardwired. As Rob and Justin pointed out, you need to have trained this and talked about what you're going to do. And the Coast Guard lacked procedures at that time in place in our training program. We lacked formalized procedures on specifically and exactly what we want you to do. And so we did a round turn on that and came a very, very long way. We aligned our procedures, not only within the MH65, but also in the MH60 community to be exactly the same. And to that end, we also mandated a lot of training to go along with that. We had historically mandated a certain number of instrument approaches, both on just in the regular IMC environment down to airports, but also instrument approaches to the water. But we had not mandated that you had to do a number of instrument takeoffs. And so what that was doing was not necessarily ensuring that all of our crews were departing the water in a similar, same controlled fashion. At the same time, our sterile cockpit procedures, as Rob pointed to, were lacking, as a crew might be finishing up a hoist or hoist work over the bay or over the water. They were not necessarily all focused on the same task at hand. There were oftentimes divisions of duties and radio calls and intercockpit communications that weren't all aligned or at least all sequenced properly. So we fixed that as well. We also mandated that you had to not only talk about inadvertent IMC before certain check rides and flights, it had to be pre-briefed before every flight, had to be discussed on the when, where, and what we do for inadvertent IMC to at least start that conversation for each flight every day. And the other thing we did was we mandated that to be part of the price of admission to come down for your annual proficiency course in our simulators here. And we said, you're going to have to go inadvertent IMC in the sim during your week. We have 10 hours of simulator sessions once a year. You come down for a week to Mobile for refresher training where you do some check rides. Part of those check rides includes inadvertent IMC. So we put all of that together to, again, establish good, solid neurological pathways that essentially override instinct and have pilots and crews embrace the training that they've been instilled. And so those procedures that we have formalized are pretty simple. We don't necessarily weigh them as anything complex, but we went for the simple route. It is what we call a boldface procedure, which means they are required memory items. If a crew encounters it, they have steps that they must follow that have to be committed to memory. And so they're pretty simple. They essentially say that the crew must, step 1, announce inadvertent IMC. They must establish an instrument scan. They must establish a safe altitude and airspeed for the environment that they're in. And then the 4th step, that's non-boldface, essentially says that the external communication should be completed as required. If you look at those, again, the simple rote that comes out oftentimes is announce, establish. Announce inadvertent IMC. That goes a very, very long way to that first point that Dr. Carvalhos talked about for a mitigating strategy, which was crew coordination. When a member of the crew comes over the ICS and says we're inadvertent IMC, that is an admission to not only that the pilot himself, but also to the entire crew this is the situation at hand. We have a new, very, very clear and dangerous priority that we must address. So, and again, if you're even just in a single pilot aircraft with no crew, saying inadvertent IMC out loud is still that same self-admission that this is the reality that I'm in. That acknowledgement goes a very long way. And again, the next thing that Dr. Carvalhos pointed to after crew coordination was better scanning. So again, establish an instrument scan. We are directing you to give up on VMC and to absolutely commit to that instrument scan. And then at that point, where's the safest altitude and airspeed and heading that you can get to for IFR? Again, many times we want you to keep the attitude that you've got initially until you can get yourself in a nice safe profile before making those turns. So that essentially, again, it wraps up what we had done. We did look at initially when we were rolling these steps and procedures out about trying to train unusual attitudes in the aircraft. We couldn't quite get there as far as a risk mitigation for a good training strategy and protocols for helicopters. But what we did do is we put that in the simulator as well as something that we could do there, and we do there as well. But that's that again is really what part of the story that I was asked to tell and wanted to share was essentially the evolution of our training program as it went from 2010 to 2021, where we have crews like Rob that go out and do these things. And again, just as a safety officer, I'd be remiss if I didn't continue to beat that drum that aviation is absolutely still a community of oral traditions. We, just like the cavemen of long ago, there's a select few that goes out on the hunt over the hill and then comes back and sits around the campfire and tells the story. We can't put all of us in every aircraft for every mission. And so we're counting on crews to go out on a flight, come back and sit down around that campfire and tell us the story and tell us what went well, tell us what didn't go well, so that we can all learn and we can all get better. And again, that is the most fundamental thing of a safety program that you want to have people share in an environment where they're free of reprisal, because we will not ever be able to learn all the lessons ourselves in aviation. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it back to Mr. Chris Hill.
Hey, thanks, Ben. I appreciate that. And if I could have the rest of your colleagues join me on screen here, we'll go ahead and take a crack at answering a few questions. While I have everybody joining us, I'll just remind everybody, if you're not aware, down at the bottom of your panel, you will, somebody's sharing a screen there. While we sort that out, I will just invite people to come up and take a look at the Q&A tab at the bottom. And we'll go ahead and, if you want to go ahead and send in your questions, if we get an opportunity, we certainly would like to hear from you and answer those questions at the end of this event. For those of you who did not hear the entire story, because there's lots of good information that came out really fast, we will provide a recording, as Dan mentioned, and he'll refer to that in the closing. So just getting kicked off right off the bat, I'd like to acknowledge our first questioner, Mr. Frank Colucci. Frank is a past Salute to Excellence recipient for the Communications Award in 2018. He's a well-respected journalist, and we're glad to have him on board here. He has a good question. I'll go ahead and take the first part of it, and then I'll probably kick it over to you, Dr. Carvalhos, once we get you back on screen. And if we can't, then we'll just have you turn on your microphone and help us. So he asked, can you contrast a double IMC spatial disorientation with CFIT or controlled flight into terrain, and how are the mitigations different? The one thing I like to remember when I hear the word CFIT, the first word is control. So controlled flight in the terrain is a key differentiator than some of the events that we typically have with double IMC events that are sometimes ultimately end up with a loss of control. So when you're in controlled flight, either you just descended and you were unaware that you were descending because you're not paying attention, or you might have had a type of spatial disorientation that's unrecognized. You didn't know that you were not controlling the aircraft properly. So Tony, I'll just ask you if we can hear you, if you have anything else to add on the differences there and the mitigations.
Yeah, Chris, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you just, I'm trying to click on my video, but it says I need someone from that side to turn it on. It must be off on that side.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. We'll get our folks to work on that if you want to turn on your video and we can see you, and then we'll work on the rest.
So I think you covered it. I don't think there's much else to expand on. That CFIT, one assumes controlled, right? So through the analysis, you would make the determination as to what level of awareness that individual had, whether there was some sort of sensory compromise, and then you would reclassify that CFIT, which is an event, it's a consequence, as opposed to an IMC, which is a condition that ultimately resulted in some maybe CFIT, but maybe some other recovered scenario. So those are actually an actual condition in the IMC, as opposed to a CFIT, which is actually the consequence, the mishap itself. And then through analysis, you'd make the determination as to whether sensory deprivation or confusion was a cause. Over.
Okay, thanks for that, Doc. Looks like we lost Rob now, so we'll get Tony's back, and Rob, we'll try to get him back, but we know you're there. We'll work on it some one way or the other. So Commander Walton, I'll just call you Ben because that's how I know you. So Ben, as you got the handoff on this particular challenge of implementing, whether it was you or your colleagues before you, what do you characterize as the biggest challenge to the changing of the culture in the organization to get them to acknowledge that they needed to improve their training from what they were doing before? Did you see any big issues? And the reason I ask is that's a current challenge for us in the commercial industry around the globe, is how are we going to convince people to make a change that can truly improve everyone's ability to understand, adapt, recognize, and recover from double IMC spatial disorientation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we, one of the things that we like Dr. Carvalhos pointed out is that sometimes there is a stigma that it's that the inferior pilot, or Justin, you pointed out there's an inferior pilot that gets into these situations. And so there has to be an acknowledgement and just being very real about it, like we said today, is that this is going to happen to all of us at some point. And I think we went ahead and acknowledged that if there was any core of pilots out there in the nation that was going to be more prone to go inadvertent IMC than a Coast Guard helicopter pilot, you'd be hard pressed to find one. Just as Rob said, we are charged to go out in bad weather, and we're also charged to do a visual mission. And so we operate on the edges of that. And so it was seen as a hedge and a process improvement. I think the big thing was honestly trying to get to a point where the training and the realism was often enough and good enough that it stuck. I think now we're the benefactors of a nice long running culture of it that it's ingrained and we've gotten there. But before that, it was definitely that. And I think, to be honest too, there were a lot of people who had different ideas about what and how inadvertent IMC recovery or procedure should look like. The 65 community had our IDs in the 60 community. So the same group of helicopter pilots within the same community both thought we had a better idea about what this should look like. And again, we had to get in a room and arm wrestle and figure out what that should look like as well. So I think that level of input or insight that people feel like they have on this is also something that you want to have a lot of buy-in for as well.
All right, thanks for that, Ben. Let's go over to you, Rob. Congratulations on your award again. I appreciate you coming on board today, and looking forward to hearing more from you. So, what would you say to pilots who have overconfident? This question came from Gabriel Amato, and he asked, what would you say to pilots who have overconfidence with the high number of flight hours that they have? And what advice you have to get them to understand they always need to be focusing on reviewing and updating their personal minimums?
Certainly, I appreciate that question. I think we talk about this a lot here at Cape Cod. The most hazardous pairing is two pilots with a bunch of hours. That's when we get complacent. That's when we let our guard down. This pairs with a couple of questions I saw. What about people flying less capable aircraft, single pilot? Respecting your own abilities and the weather is 9/10 of the battle. I think an important distinction where we're talking about spatial disorientation today and linking that to inadvertent IMC. What about intentional IMC? What's the difference between inadvertent and intentional? And I think it's Tony's countermeasures. If you look at the countermeasures he spoke about, anticipating the conditions, having a plan, using the automation, using the tools you have, no matter what those are, you can overcome a lot of the hazards we're talking about today. So as far as low hours, I would take a low hour co-pilot any day. I think that might be a safer pairing than some of my buddies, including myself, with a little more hours.
Hey, great. Appreciate that insight, Rob. Hey, is your colleague Justin still there with you?
He is, yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Lieutenant Justin Moore, you don't get to hide anymore. We're bringing you in. So thanks for participating. As a former safety guy in the organization, I appreciate the hard work that you do, and I wish you all the best continuing to advance safety. You certainly did that really well with this particular scenario. So I'll just ask you, and maybe you can share with others in the commercial world, what's your basic process that you use at Air Station Cape Cod, and I arguably throughout the Coast Guard, I think it's pretty standardized, to identify and address hazards before they turn into a catastrophic event? This being one example, but could you just talk about the basic process, who gets involved, and how it's a more transparent process for your reporting culture in the Coast Guard?
That's an excellent question, sir. I think it actually in somewhat will answer the previous question about confidence. A flight safety officer's responsibility is to identify hazards and help the population assess their severity, how bad that hazard can be, and more importantly, the probability. I think those of us in safety circles know that these things happen. And so the probability is something we weight higher in that severity probability matrix. And we need to inform others of that. So the very first place I look with any mishap is inside of our unit specifically. Have we done this before? Then I look inside the airframe as a Coast Guard whole. And then I start looking at the Coast Guard as a whole. And that's actually how we came to this answer. We realized that the word spatial disorientation just didn't exist outside of one very small portion of a H60 recurrent training syllabus. And so I look at historical mishaps, then I look at how the organization treats it across itself, and then I look at industry. Your organization is actually a website that I visited in the process of putting together these recommendations, because as we said earlier, these are problems of aerodynamics and human factors, and whether you're in a Cessna or the space shuttle on reentry, you're going to be faced with aerodynamics and human factors. So what works for somebody in an organization or a country far removed from our mission set is probably going to have an impact for us. We just have to figure out how to apply it. So I start looking at ourselves, and then I realize I'm only one perspective, and I reach out to Commander Walton or Doc Carvalhos, and I get their opinion because they've been around the organization longer, and they know what will work or why it didn't work in the past. And it's a very collaborative process. But it's also somewhat on the initiative of the organization, because if it doesn't become a tragedy, then it stays at the unit level, and it's up to us to kind of etch out how far it goes. And it's one of those things where you hope to have the good support where a crew will come in and tell you what happened, and then they'll participate. And then you hope to have the leadership that will back you up when you put these recommendations forward. And the Coast Guard does that across the board since I've been in it. So they make it very easy to make meaningful change.
Awesome. Appreciate that, Justin. And you guys heard it, it really does come from the top down and the bottom up. It has to be a very broad culture that's accepted everywhere. And the Coast Guard certainly has taken their lumps on past tragedies, and they've learned their lessons, and they've got the full backing of their leadership and everyone out there. That's the key. So good luck with keeping that going and advancing it all even further as you move along. So next question, we have a few questions from one of our loyal viewers, Richard Gallagher. Thank you for that. I do believe, excuse me, Rob, I do believe you answered this question, but I'm going to confirm. When you first got vertigo, did you change the attitude of the aircraft at the time you moved your head position without visual reference to the ground? I believe you mentioned you were in a decelerating turning maneuver with your head down. So just confirming that, is that an accurate assessment? Anything to add?
Yes, sir. Yes, that's correct. We were, talking back to Tony's countermeasures, I don't think we were doing the best job of hedging our bets, and this is what we were doing. We had two lights out either side, so we were both pretty much heads down. I was the non-flying pilot, but monitoring the instruments, and we were decelerating, turning, communicating all at once. This is about an hour into our search. I think the combination of flying with another instructor now, higher hour guy, I trusted. He actually reported here with me from Sitka, and I will be the first to acknowledge there was a sense of complacency as I'm running fuel calcs and communicating all at once. So to answer the question, yes, heads down, looking outside, trying to maintain a visual scan in very poor instrument conditions was directly a contributing factor to this.
Okay, great, thanks. And Mr. Gallagher, we're going to go ahead and just follow up with your next question. I'm going to take a crack at this. I might modify it a little bit if you'll indulge me. So this will start out, I'll take it to you, Ben. Have you provided any mitigations for if somebody recognizes that they have some sort of spatial D? And is there some trick? I know, Tony, I want you to follow up with Ben on some of the science behind this, but is there anything that you train for folks to recover from spatial disorientation other than the checklist that you provided there, which we can show again? Anything that you, tricks like movement of the head, any tactics, techniques, procedures that you train in your recovery procedure?
Specifically not for physiological movements there. What we see often is we have our unusual attitude recovery that comes right before that inadvertent IIMC procedure that is also a bold face. And it has an order of operations that's going to keep the aircraft in a as benign a state as possible. So it's level the wings, put the nose on the horizon, center the ball, and then add power as necessary. We don't want air crews leading with power as the first input. We want the aircraft in as stable a profile and as well trimmed as possible before we make any other changes. And so what we'll often see in the simulator in the back as we're giving this, when a crew goes inadvertent IIMC, a lot of times what we'll hear over ICS is a pilot will say wings, nose, ball, power. And what we like about that is how readily it comes to them. But at the same time, if you think about your dashboard, that's your first lap in the instrument scan pattern as well. And so that gets a guy or gal started with because again, you're changing from, as Rob was, looking down and outside to now I need to come inside. Where should my eyes go? And if I can do a wings, nose, ball, power, I at least have done that first lap around the dashboard there.
Okay, great. And Tony, real quick, if I could kick it to you on the science. So we recently released some training on recovery from IIMC, and we got some feedback from some people who participated in the development of this course about different techniques to recover. And there's I don't know if it's widely adapted in the United States, but perhaps overseas, there's some techniques, people talking about looking at the attitude indicator, shaking their head, small movements of the head intentionally to do some sort of recaging of their internal gyro, perhaps. Is this anything that you've heard of in the science that you've worked with in human behavior, human performance?
Chris, I'm not aware of that research, but certainly independent of some calibration or confirmation from the visual system, and that is going to your instruments and getting a bearing. Independent of that, the vestibular system, there's nothing you can do to gradually provide a different inputs because it doesn't know its orientation. So any input there is just going to be misinterpreted. Same thing with the proprioceptive. So any countermeasure has to be augmenting that visual sensory system with the true orientation to then provide that reinforcement back to the vestibular and say, oh, you're wrong. I'm going to take these cues and behave in a fashion to be consistent with my visual input. So I'm not aware of anything that you can do independently of the visual reinforcement of what your true state is.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, we got a few more questions in the queue here. One from Stan Rose. Welcome, Stan. Thanks for joining us here today. He asked, after committing to instruments, do you abort the mission, or is there an ability to become reoriented and recommit to the mission? So as you obviously you spend a lot of time on scene in the clouds with a rescue perhaps underway, lives at risk. How do you recover and get back on scene? Are there instances where it's just you decide it's too hard and move on? I'll direct that to you, Rob.
All right, thanks for the question. As Commander Walton said earlier, we practice getting back into that visual environment. We have instrument approaches to the water. So the short answer is no. If we go in inadvertent IIMC, we're certainly going to take a round turn on risk. We're going to reassess where's the risk versus gain on this particular case. Maybe it's not, the juice isn't worth the squeeze on this one. But in all likelihood, it could be. There could be a person in the water down there, and we're going to probably come up with a plan to hedge our bets, set up those countermeasures, as Tony said, and go back into it with a better plan and better automation, ready to encounter those low-vis situations. So we have an instrument approach to the water, two versions, one to get us to an exact point in space, and one is fully coupled. So I often defer to that coupled approach. Let the helicopter fly its itself in a hover and let's monitor, because it's a lot easier to monitor than to put the inputs in yourself. So to answer the question, no, we wouldn't just give up. We have some procedures in place to get back to visual.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And I would be remiss without indicating that as a commercial industry that we vastly represent, that those instances where somebody encounters double IMC and recovers safely may not be as many opportunities or necessity to regain visual and continue on a mission after you've experienced that traumatic event. Maybe it's just best to go home and count your blessings. So I'll just throw that out there.
For sure. And I certainly don't want to minimize that we will reassess risk. It could very well change the calculus for us and mean it's not worth pushing anymore. We really emphasize reassessing that risk as the mission continues. So
Right.
Thanks for reinforcing
You know,
that.
every company out there should have their own policy to acknowledge this event and how they want to handle it as it relates to their own unique situation. All right, we have somebody visiting from the State Police of Sao Paulo, Brazil, Mr. Felipe Cabanas. I hope I didn't butcher that too bad. So he asked, he would like to know if you only train double IMC on simulators or you try to simulate it somehow in real flights too. I know you mentioned, one of you mentioned that. I'll kick it to you, Ben, that there was some effort to actually do in-aircraft training. And I know there's capabilities out there now that are providing some folks opportunities to represent some of the proprioceptive and vestibular illusions along with the visual that's out there. And go ahead and comment on that, Ben, and any plans to adapt some of those newer technologies.
Absolutely, yes, sir. So we do train inadvertent IMC in the aircraft, and it is on many of the syllabus items as a required flight maneuver. So most instructors will find that that situation where they essentially unexpectedly announce, "Hey, we're in the clouds," and then at that point, the pilot under instruction has to go through the steps and procedures. Oftentimes, too, a pilot may even say, "Simulated we're inadvertent IMC. I'm going to try to regain visual." Right, go through those instinctual behaviors and force that pilot to come on the controls and mandate a control swap if that other pilot has those negative behaviors. At the same time, like you mentioned, we tried to get to unusual attitude recovery in the aircraft. We just couldn't quite get there. The concern there always is that you've already put the aircraft in a slightly compromised state for the unusual attitude, and if a pilot then comes on, like, puts their head up, opens their eyes, and comes on and makes the wrong input, now you've further aggravated it. So there's a piece of that we just couldn't quite get to, but absolutely, yes, inadvertent IMC in the aircraft. And as Rob pointed to as well, we also train that the flight director modes or autopilot capabilities, if you've got them, how to get on those as quickly as possible as a form of stabilization as well. We want to teach pilots how to transfer on and off the flight director modes to help stabilize that aircraft.
That's a great pitch for folks out there contemplating automation. If you don't already have it and it's time to upgrade an aircraft, try to make sure you take the opportunity to exploit those new capabilities of autopilot, stability augmentation. But this question will be back for you, Rob. What about those pilots who don't have the luxury of automation? They're flying single pilot, they have zero automation. How can we help them with all this information?
First of all, a less capable aircraft, I respect anyone who's flying that, because I feel a little gun shy going into battle without a co-pilot, without the automation I have. So kudos to anyone out there flying those single engine aircraft and trying to maintain VMC. I think the answer is you gotta honor VMC for what it is. You can't be pushing it. And you have to have a game plan for when your plan doesn't work out. What are you gonna do when you pop into a cloud? I'm lucky I have capable tools, but if you don't have those tools at your disposal, you really have to honor that weather forecast and have a good plan for when you get caught off guard.
Good stuff. Appreciate that. So I'll go ahead and give you guys an opportunity as we come to the closing time here. I just want to go around the horn here. We'll start in sequence of when you guys spoke. What's the one thing that you would like to leave behind for the listeners today as it relates to how they can be better prepared to deal with spatial disorientation and double IMC? Rob, you first.
I think a number of people touched on it, Justin and Tony in particular, of setting yourself up for this. We do it when we intentionally enter the IMC environment. When we go out there on purpose and we're putting ourselves in these situations, we are set up as much as you can. We have our We have a rad-out bug that lets us know as we descend below a certain altitude. We've set up altitude hold, and we've set up every tool we can in our favor. We've checked the weather. We have a pilot monitoring. We've done everything we can. I think the hardest thing is in this spatial disorientation conversation is it's too late by the time you get there. It's really hard to overcome those conflicting cues. I can just speak to that from as my experience. The best strategy is to avoid it altogether and set up your helicopter, set up your brief, set up your approach to the situation to avoid it altogether. That's my takeaway.
All right, great. Thanks. Tony?
I would say know your limitations. Realize that human physiology has limitations. There are operational limits, just like there are operational limits with our material assets. The human body has operational limits. Know what those are and apply the appropriate mitigation strategies, which is through awareness and identifying, surveilling, and monitoring your environment to take the appropriate action and acknowledge that I'm in one of those operational limits threshold. So that would be mine. Know your limits.
Thanks. Thanks, Tony. Ben?
I would say that it's a continually updated process. We had a mishap in Kodiak of inadvertent IIMC, and while the crew did talk about it in the pre-flight brief because the weather was marginal, they went inadvertent IIMC at the last moment while trying to recover for the field. And the comments from the commanding officer I thought were just really telling and insightful. It essentially just said that an inadvertent IIMC brief is only as good as the last time it was updated. And so once you get out on scene, to acknowledge, hey, if guys, now that we're out here, if you're going to inadvertent IIMC, we will do this, a heading, an altitude, or just at least a kind of game plan of those first few critical seconds. And just that essentially, again, is that crew coordination, that mitigation number 2 that Doc Carvalhos talked about, that just said, if this happens, this is what we're going to do, rather than when we talked about it an hour and a half ago at the pre-flight brief.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ben. I will take the opportunity to answer one final question from Gabriel Amato. Gabriel asked, are there any courses to train disorientation safely? So what I will do briefly is I will share my screen, make one more plug for something that you guys have probably heard about plenty from us if you've been tuning in to anything that HAI has been promoting or the USHST. So the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, in collaboration with many other folks with HAI and the new Vertical Aviation Safety Team, have collaborated to develop a 56 Seconds to Live program, and just released a course recently to actually go through an online course to give you some key tips and advice on how you can recognize, avoid, become more aware, and finally, if all else fails, recover from an inadvertent IIMC event. But specifically to your question, training safely, the only way to really do it properly is actually finally get into an aircraft. And while we can't necessarily endorse any one particular operator, if you go to this one particular page, ushst.org/56secs, if someone could put that in the chat window for everybody, I'd appreciate that. But we list several sources in the left side here, whether it be online or ground school training. These are just some examples that you can go to, but just do your own research and find out what works best for you. So with that, thank you for attending today. I'm going to turn it over to Dan Sweet, who has some cleanup items as we go. And I wanted to give one final thank you to each of you, our panelists today, for attending today, and appreciate it and hope to see you again, and best of luck in your future endeavors.
Thank you, Chris. Tony, before I get to everything else, you were killing me a second ago. One of my favorite movie quotes, and one that Jim Viola used in a webinar recently when you were giving your final thought. Quote from Clint Eastwood, Magnum Force, Dirty Harry, back in the 70s. A man's got to know his limitations.
There you go.
I think there's something we can all learn from that. So, Lieutenant Commander McCabe, Lieutenant Moore, Commander Walton, and Dr. Carvalhos, thank you so much for joining us today. I can tell you that the audience engagement for this webinar was off the charts. I think that the topic is something that everybody's interested in. And I expect that the video views will go off the charts on this one as well. The information you gave was fantastic. Thank you so much for giving your time and your experience, sharing your knowledge with us. It's deeply appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.
Okay, I will get into the housekeeping details here for the very end. And I do want to share the document again that they talked about during Commander Walton's presentation. The U.S. Coast Guard document, Unusual Attitudes, you can find that on our website, rotor.org/May20. That's just an abbreviated, they call it a redirect. Should make it fairly easy for you to find. I'll leave that up for just a second. And then I sent out the link for the one for the USHST link. It was rotor.org 56 SECS, S-E-C-S. I'm sorry, I sent it out singular. It is plural. Add an S to the end of that, please, if you want to see that. Save the date. Next week webinar is another interesting one. We think that it's going to really appeal to the operators and pilots in the industry. Why you might or should have drones in your future. This is going to be industry leaders who have already incorporated UAS aircraft into their operations, and they're going to share their experiences. They have discovered a few areas where they made mistakes, and they learned from them. And you're going to be able to learn from their errors and what they're doing right, most importantly. The future of aviation seems to be trending towards the advanced air mobility. The drones, remotely piloted aircraft or uncrewed aircraft, however you want to phrase it. This one's going to be something that a lot of people will want to watch as well. Speaking of remotely piloted aircraft, we still have material in our company store, HAI store, for Helicopter Association Interplanetary. The Mars helicopter continues to fly. It's been doing great for us up there. You really can't get much more remotely piloted than that right now, but I'm sure that they're already working on the next generation. But join us in celebrating the first flight on a distant planet. There is a questionnaire that'll be coming out to you shortly. We do appreciate that if you take a few minutes to share your thoughts on today's webinar or on future webinars you'd like to see. There have been a number of people who've asked for topics like today's on UIMC and spatial disorientation. So we hope that this met your requirements or met your interests. If there's something HAI can do for you, please let us know that too. The easiest way to do that is to reach out to Jim Viola directly at president@rotor.org. Tell us what you'd like to know. Tell us what you'd like to see us do. Tell us how we can better serve you as members. Whether it's up on Capitol Hill, state governments around the world, if it's safety, if it's operational, if it's regulatory, we're always interested in hearing what you need from us. This is a great time to look at joining HAI if you're not a member. We're going to be transitioning a lot of our website over to members only content here in the next few months. And so you don't want to miss out on some of the greatest safety and regulatory and advocacy and operational content that's available right now. And I think that wraps it up for today. Gosh, we appreciate the fact that you joined us for this incredible webinar, one of the best ones I believe we've had in a long, long time. Please join us for next week's webinar or future webinars. If you did miss anything in the past, those are also available on our website at rotor.org/webinar. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.